Okay, thanks everyone for joining us for this seminar. We'll just get started. Hopefully the online people we need is okay. So first up today, give us a talk on trauma and neurodevelopment.
Yeah.
Professor Helen Minnis.
Thank you very much, Michael. I picked this to talk about today because, can you all hear me okay? You hear me online? Excellent. I picked this because it's really influenced. We're actually mainly doing randomised control trials on our team, but this has just really influenced our thinking about all of the work we do. So it was a bit of a kind of surprise. So we all know that abuse and neglect causes psychiatric problems. Well, actually, the big surprise to me was that actually there are very few symptoms, mental health symptoms that you really can attribute to abuse and neglect. And actually a minority of people who've been abused and neglected get these symptoms. So there's two disorders in the psychiatric classification systems that are specifically associated with abuse and neglect. There's disinhibited social engagement disorder, which is characterised by indiscriminate behaviours. And this is a research assistant of mine a few years ago in an orphanage in South Africa. And you can see her basically being covered in children. That's the characteristic of disinhibited social engagement disorder, because the attachment specialist taught us all, if any of you did psychology, that you're supposed to have stranger anxiety. So you're not supposed to let people go near to strangers. And these children do, they put themselves at risk. And then there's reactive attachment disorder. And reactive attachment disorder is really a developmental emergency, in my view, because it's a shutting down of the attachment system. Children with reactive attachment disorder don't seek or accept comfort. And of course, you need help as a young child, so they don't get the help they need for development. These are the only two disorders that are specifically associated with abuse and neglect. And then we always think about post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, a number of people who've been abused and neglected do get post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's not specific because you can get PTSD from being in a car accident, for example. But there has been, really since the Frailty studies, which are now 25 years old, lots and lots of research, thousands of studies showing that adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, and what's been called household dysfunction, things like having a parent with a severe mental illness or addictions, is associated with in a dose-response relationship with a whole range of physical and mental health problems. And so we've known for probably 40 years that depression is associated with adverse life events in early childhood. That's old news. But what was good news really for the medical and scientific communities 25 years ago was that there was a dose-response relationship between adverse childhood experiences and heart problems, heart disease. And it's been shown from cancers, diabetes, a whole range of health problems, physical and mental. So the bigger the load of adversities that the child carries, the bigger the risk. But we noticed a couple of real kind of conundrums with abused and neglected children when working with them clinically. So first of all, many abused and neglected children, even if they've experienced really severe abuse and neglect, don't develop mental health problems. And you don't really notice that unless you're a researcher, because if you're purely a clinician, you only see the kids with problems. So this really, I mean, even though I knew it from the epidemiology, actually, when you meet children who've had terrible experiences and yet they're fine, it really does wake you up that there's something else going on. But what we also found was that if children did have mental health problems and they'd been abused and neglected, they tended to have really complex, overlapping mental health problems, multi-morbidity. So obviously that's caused by maltreatment. You would think. So again, the bigger the load the child carries, the bigger their risk of health problems. And that is absolutely clear from the epidemiology. But actually, not all people who have a big load of adversities end up developing health problems at all. So something else is going on. And we also had noticed that the complex overlapping problems are often neurodevelopmental, so things like ADHD, autism, intellectual disabilities, which are thought to be heritable. So we decided to look at this in a big twin study a number of years ago. It's a really big study, and it was just because it was big that we used it. We weren't actually thinking of using it in terms of usual genetics, but we asked about, the team had asked about, we didn't ask, they had asked about symptoms of ADHD, autism, tic disorders and intellectual disabilities when children were aged 9, and it's a well-validated symptom checklist validated against diagnosis. And we asked the question, are abused and neglected children more likely to have multiple comorbid neurodevelopmental problems? And the answer was yes. But it was an even more striking yes than I've seen clinically. So maltreated children are nearly 10 times as likely to have symptoms in 3 or more of these clusters. So it doesn't really matter which, compared to their non-maltreated peers. So that complexity was really striking. And then because it was a twin study, we were able to look at the etiology. So the question was, does the maltreatment cause this load of neurodevelopmental symptoms, conditions? And I have to say that I had always assumed that it did, but actually what we found was a little bit different. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through this. We used something called the co-twin control design. And essentially each twin has their co-twin. And in this huge population, there were quite a number of twins where one twin had been maltreated and the other hadn't, perhaps because it was a devotion to the family. You can't tell why in a study like this. So we just look at the identical twins, first of all, and as you'll know, identical twins share 100% of their genetic material. So the big question is, these are the neurodevelopmental conditions that children have. And if the neurodevelopmental conditions are caused by abuse and neglect, and what you'd expect in their co-twins is much less in the way of neurodevelopmental conditions. Always feel you should have a drum roll at this point. So the big question is, what is the kind of neurodevelopmental symptom load in the co-twins? And what we found was it was pretty much exactly the same. There's no difference in the twins that had been abused and neglected and the twins that hadn't. So what this suggests is that no, maltreatment doesn't cause the ADHD, the autism, the intellectual disability in these children. Actually, both the abuse and neglect and this complex overlapping multimorbid neurodevelopmental syndrome seems to be caused by additional genetic factors. So we had these behavioural geneticists in Sweden. We were over Skype because this was 2017, and I could see Ruchika Gadwani, my colleague, and she was like this. We were really perplexed. It was not at all what we expected. And then I realised, because I could see more in videos, that I was the same. So we both went away for a long weekend and we came back and we both thought, we think we know what's going on here. And we still don't know for definite because you can't tell from the study, but just wonder, is this neurodevelopmental conditions running in the family? Because these things are heritable. They do run very strongly in families. So we always thought of the intergenerational transmission of abuse and neglect. Maybe underlying that is intergenerational transmission of neurodevelopmental conditions. So abuse and neglect does not always cause psychiatric problems. Could neurodevelopmental problems cause abuse and neglect? And that's the big question. Which is the chicken, which is the egg? And we don't know the answer to this, but Evie Balling, the PhD student sitting here, she just published a really nice systematic review on that in JCPP Advances, if you're interested, just really trying to tease this apart from longitudinal, prospective longitudinal studies. And really the answer is you can't tease it apart. We don't know the answer to this. But it's really important to remember that if children have these problems, parents may also have heritable problems with impulse control, problems with language, social understanding, etc. And that losing your temper can be a sign of those too. And if life stress is big for these families, then maybe for some families it could be a toxic mixture and abuse and neglect can arise. So Ruchika and I have come up with this double jeopardy hypothesis. And we look back at the same population, but we didn't use it as a twin study here. And what we found is that if you have both neurodevelopmental conditions and experiences of abuse and neglect at age 9, you're actually at twice the risk of having mania symptoms in adolescence So which came first, the chicken and the egg? And we don't know the answer to this, but really the message is that as clinicians, we need to embrace both. So if a child or an adult has a history of abuse and neglect, we need to be thinking about your developmental conditions as well as trauma-related symptoms. And we need to be thinking about these attachment disorders, PTSD, and just keep an open mind and avoid jumping to conclusions. Don't make an omelette, because then you may never find out what's actually going on. So, your thoughts? Questions, comments?
We'll take some questions from the room first, then we'll see if there's any questions online. So does anyone have any questions?
I did, but kind of tie in like, trauma to like a whole diagnosis. But could it not be also like behaviours and like more like the specific what you call symptoms or experiences, or how you look at it? I don't know, like whole diagnosis like schizophrenia or something, you look at just delusions or specific behaviours that are linked to that treatment rather than the whole.
I think in a sense, you're asking about the kind of categorical approach to mental health, and I think that's a whole other argument. Psychiatric diagnoses are just made up of they're just collections of symptoms, and to be honest, they're usually devised by people sitting around in committees. They're not necessarily based on, they're not always based on big epidemiological studies. So really, these are about symptoms, but what the epidemiology tells us is that the symptoms that are associated with abuse and neglect, nobody's ever found specific symptoms other than that are in these kind of bags, and they're just convenient bags. But basically, I think the key thing to take away is that indiscriminate behaviours where children just will go to anyone, or a kind of shutting down of the attachment system, those are real signs of early abuse and neglect and something to worry about. But really, I think the message of this is that all of these other mental health symptoms may not actually be anything to do with the abuse and neglect. And I think that's where we've got to keep an open mind. And I think what happens is, in clinical practice, people often assume that this can't really be ADHD because you've been abused and neglected, so it must be due to the abuse and neglect. I think what our research shows is that when you think about it, if you were thinking about a physical illness, say you'd fallen and you'd broken your leg, that doesn't mean you couldn't also get diabetes. So I think it's just remembering that people who've been abused and neglected can get problems in all of these other areas as well, and they're not necessarily caused by.
Except that you said there are 10 times the risk of
Yeah.
abuse and neglect.
No, they're at 10 times the risk of having these symptoms if they've been abused and neglected. And that's what really confuses clinicians. So the group of children who have been abused and neglected have a big load of mental health problems, but we don't think that most of those problems are caused by the abuse and neglect. The high-risk group. And what we suspect, but we don't know yet, is that these children are actually much, much harder to look after. And so if other things are going on, they might be at more risk of being abused and neglected.
Yeah. That's separate.
Well, I think there are ways we're trying to do it. It hasn't been done yet, but it's a lot of people really trying to separate which is cause and effect here. Sorry. I think Katie was just before you, actually.
Yeah, no, really fascinating. What I was wondering was, as a clinician, change how you treat someone.
Yes, because you have to think about both. And I think that it shouldn't change what treatment you've done if you do a good assessment. But what happens in this field is people don't do a good assessment because, especially the children, they just think, oh, you've been abused and neglected, no wonder you're behaving that way. When in fact, you may actually have a treatable problem like ADHD.
I was sorry, Helen, give me a sense of these epigenetic effects.
So you wouldn't, yeah. So not in this study. We were just talking about behavioural genetics study. Now we've done a systematic review of epigenetics in the context of abuse and neglect, and there are epigenetic changes. So that's a whole interesting thing, and it seems to be mostly epigenetic changes in the stress response system. So that's a whole other fascinating.
There is one online question. Hamish, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you very much, Helen. I was just wondering if there was much evidence around the sort of dose of trauma and abuse at a young age, and whether those people who who had experience of an adverse child experience maybe, but didn't get problems later on, if that was because the sort of the level of abuse wasn't enough.
This is a hugely active area of research. There's lots of the big cohort studies like ALSPAC are trying to find out whether timing of abuse and neglect or particular constellations or types. And nobody's really been able to tease this apart. There seems to be either severe abuse and neglect or less severe. But in our work, in our the research that we've really launched this, all of the children have been severely abused and neglected. And yet, at the age of about 5, half of them have a mental health problem. So it seems to be more to do with other factors rather than the quality of the abuse and neglect. But I mean, ask me in 10 years' time, there'll have been lots of research on this because a lot of people are looking into that.
Thank you.
Sorry, Carolyn. One online question from Carolyn.
Oh yeah, hi. I had an interesting, or I found that a really interesting, or like a really interesting talk, and I found it interesting that you put it in the frame of the kind of ACEs evidence, because you talked a little bit about actually getting away from that mindset of if somebody comes in and is showing perhaps some psychiatric symptoms that it is necessarily a result of adverse childhood experiences. I wonder, how do you position what you're finding within the more kind of critical stuff around adverse childhood experiences that's coming out that suggests that perhaps the science on that isn't as settled as has been suggested, or perhaps it's taken a very specific lens on much broader, maybe structural things. And I'm interested to know.
Yeah, I've been one of those that's kind of wellied into that debate. So with an epidemiologist called Rebecca Lacey, Rebecca and I did a paper, it was published, I think it was 2020 in the JCPP, and it was about this whole ACEs debate. And Rebecca, I think she's a non-clinician, and she was very much coming from the standpoint, that ACEs scale, cumulative way of looking at it is that is simplistic. And I was saying yes, but for policymakers, it's also beautifully simple. So we tried to do a kind of both and. I think there are pros and cons. And I think there's a huge amount of this fascinating stuff that's just come out by, I can't remember the first author, but Jessie Baldwin's a paper that's literally just published in JCPP Advances, showing that the subjective experience of abuse and neglect seems to be much more important than the actuality of what happened, which is absolutely fascinating. It might be to do with the way that we store memories of trauma. So, I mean, it's a fascinating area, and lots of people are really looking at this. And I just think we need to wait and see where it all kind of teases itself.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Okay, I think in the interest of time, we need to move on to our next speaker, but thanks very much, Helen, and your point again. Next up, we've got Peter Hanlon, who's going to talk about applications of Frailty Index, and that comes under data science.
Thank you.
Check if online is in slideshow mode.
That looks nice.
Perfect, thank you very much. So hello, I'm Peter Hanlon. I'm a GP and a clinical research fellow in general practice and primary care. I'm slightly nervous about following Helen, now I see why, because that one is fascinating. But going to the other end of the kind of age spectrum now, I'm thinking about frailty. And I'm going to talk a bit about the Frailty Index, which is a method used to quantify frailty and some of the applications that I'm hoping to explore using that. So I'm going to talk about frailty and trying to find what it is, which may seem obvious, but I think it's quite an elusive concept to really nail down as to quite what we mean by frailty. And think about why that matters and why it's important to study it, I think. I'm then going to talk about the Frailty Index, which is one of the many ways in which frailty has been quantified and conceptualized. I'll talk a bit about our current work using the Frailty Index and some future directions or hopes of things we want to do. So I finished my PhD last year doing some of this work, and I'm hoping to try and develop some of these ideas. So I'm interested in your thoughts and feedback at the end. So frailty, to put it simply, is an age-related state of physiological, reduced physiological reserve. So people living with frailty, when they come under stress, be it by an infection, a drug side effect or whatever, are more at risk of losing function, of becoming more unwell, being admitted to hospital and of mortality in response to that stressor. And frailty has been conceptualized in a number of different ways and has a range of different health implications. Although it's defined differently in many different studies, there's a few kind of core aspects of frailty that are common to all. So frailty is multiply determined. There's not one thing that makes you live with frailty. It is the cumulative impact of a number of different disruptions or deficits across multiple body systems. It also affects people in multiple dimensions. So it's not just a physical state, it has cognitive implications, it has social implications as to how people live as they get older. And it's key to understanding frailty is that kind of multi-dimensional nature of it. This isn't simply one thing that we can pin down. And importantly as well, frailty is dynamic. So people fluctuate in their degree of frailty. It's not an inevitable consequence of aging. It can be modified and it can be responsive to intervention. But at a population level, it becomes increasingly common with age and at the extremes of age becomes very common. This increasing prevalence of frailty has important implications for public health in terms of the needs of the population for care, for risk of hospital admission, these kind of things. But from my perspective as a GP as well, it has individual implications in a number of ways, but particularly in terms of judging what the best way to respond to somebody's health needs are. So if we come back to that physiological vulnerability, people may be at increased risk of side effects that we might, of medications we might want to give for conditions, for example. They may be less able to participate in the sorts of interventions that might even be beneficial for their frailty, such as exercise and so on. So it has implications for how we tailor treatment decisions to individuals. And that's one of the aspects that I'm particularly interested in. Importantly as well, although frailty is associated, some of our earlier work showed that frailty is present, although less common, in middle age as well. So it's not something that just occurs at the extremes of age. It's really a life course phenomenon. And the bulk of people that experience frailty in middle age are from the most deprived communities. And so it has health inequalities implications as well to understand how frailty manifests and how we can impact it. So part of the reason I'm talking about the Frailty Index is that I've been lucky enough to have spent the last month in Nova Scotia in the sunshine by the coast. And as well as it being a nice place, the reason for this is that that's where Kenneth Rockwood is based. So Kenneth Rockwood came up with the Frailty Index approach to measuring frailty in 2001. And Frailty Index is one of two kind of dominant models for understanding frailty and what it is and how we measure it. So the Frailty Index essentially is a measure of frailty which counts age-related health deficits as they accumulate over the life course. So these can be long-term conditions, symptoms like breathlessness, pain, laboratory deficits like anemia or kidney function, and functional limitations like difficulty dressing or going upstairs and so on. And the basic thesis of the Frailty Index is the more of these things you accumulate over time, the greater degree of frailty someone tends to experience and the greater risk they have. And that's something we can measure in a number of different settings. Frailty Index is not a pre-specified list of things to measure. It's more an approach to quantifying overall state of health in people as they age. And the deficits that are counted in a Frailty Index have to meet certain criteria. So they have to be things that get more common with age. They have to be associated with poor health, and they have to add information to the index, by which we mean they have to be not too rare that no one in your population tends to have them, or too common such that by the age of 75, most people will be affected by these things. And one of the advantages of the Frailty Index is that if you count things in this way, even though different studies differ in what they include in the Frailty Index, the properties that we find are very consistent across different settings and across different types of study in which frailty has been quantified. So this led to the publication of a standard procedure for creating a frailty index. This is the distribution we tend to find at a population level of frailty, where there's a long tail where increasing levels of frailty are less common but more impactful. And this way of quantifying frailty has several advantages over some of its other models. So the first is that it represents a spectrum. So frailty is not an all or nothing phenomenon. There's not a point at which you have frailty where you didn't before. One way of, I like to think of this is with my grandfather who lived well into his 90s, had his first fall where he had a subdural hematoma and he was 70, and that didn't happen to him before, but he was still playing football with us on his 70th birthday and so on. So like he was developing a degree of frailty there, but had many other aspects which you wouldn't associate with frailty. He then became less mobile and so on, but still looked after my gran. And then during the pandemic, he was more like the kind of picture at the end where he became much more bedbound. You can't pinpoint a point at which any older person truly is living with frailty versus not. It's something, it's the cumulative effect of life course, essentially. And it is multidimensional. You can have some deficits in some areas, but resilience in others and so on. And from a methodological point of view, the Frailty Index has the advantage of being flexible in how it can be applied to different data sets. This has led to innovations such as this is the Electronic Frailty Index, which is now contractually obliged in primary care in England. So all people over 65 in England are screened for frailty, or well, the population is screened for frailty using essentially the Frailty Index applied to electronic medical records. Stratifies the population in terms of risk, and it predicts mortality. And what's supposed to happen is people who are at risk of severe frailty then have an individualized assessment where that's put into context of the individual. Well, that's quite what happens in practice. So it can be applied to a number of settings, such as electronic health records, which is causing frailty to become more spoken about and more tangible within the sort of context in which I work in primary care, which has led to some of my interests in this area. And how do we then use that to make better clinical decisions for individuals when we're talking about measures which were developed in large populations? So one of the uncertainties, and this is one of the things I explored in my PhD, is that when we're taking that from population to an individual approach to frailty, we come up against this problem that we make clinical decisions based on evidence, trials, and so on. And NICE and others have cautioned that people with frailty, because of exclusion criteria and so on, are often excluded from clinical trials. And therefore, you have to be careful whether the evidence and that informed guidelines is really applicable to people living with frailty who have accumulated multiple deficits across a number of different organ systems. The problem is that many trials don't measure frailty, so we don't really know how frail people in many trials are. But that's one potential application for the Frailty Index. So one of the pieces of work that I, along with others in the school here, did for part of my PhD was to take this Frailty Index approach of counting deficits across systems and to apply it to individual data from industry-sponsored drug trials to quantify the degree of frailty in people in these trials, which are often said to exclude those with frailty. And that's because trials measure long-term conditions, they measure function to some extent by quality of life questionnaires, they measure symptoms where they're relevant, and so we can apply this measure to trials. We looked at a few conditions. This was diabetes and this was the distribution. So it's the right shape, but it's a bit skewed this way. So the most extreme end of the frailty spectrum is, as you might expect, largely absent from trials because of exclusion criteria. But moderate frailty was nonetheless present within a minority of the population of people included in trials for treatments for diabetes. In rheumatoid arthritis, the distribution was much more skewed towards greater severity of frailty. Still not the kind of upper end of frailty was absent. And this largely probably reflects active disease where people have a lot of functional limitation from active rheumatoid arthritis. And some other work we've done with CEDA has shown that actually if you treat the active disease, the degree of frailty diminishes quite dramatically in people with rheumatoid arthritis. So we have to be careful how we apply labels there. And in COPD, in which frailty is certainly very common, severe frailty was pretty lacking. So many people with severe COPD in practice are living with a high degree of frailty, whereas in trials for COPD, this was largely underrepresented, but not absent. And there is some frailty there that we from. When we looked at the relationship between frailty in these trials and serious adverse events, so largely hospitalizations and deaths, in each of the index conditions, and after you control for age, sex, and the severity of the underlying condition, frailty is associated with an increased risk of adverse events. So it does appear to be clinically meaningful, even in an underrepresentative trial setting. And finally, this piece of work, which one of our integrated students completed year before last, was taking this approach to trials for dementia and cognitive impairment. It shows some really nice findings that you can use the Frailty Index to look at, one, the degree of frailty in trials for these conditions, but also the impact of including or excluding the degree of cognitive impairment as part of your Frailty Index, or simply looking at the physical aspects. And in the context of trials for dementia, if you exclude the cognitive aspects of that, then your estimation of frailty is much reduced. Perhaps you could argue underestimating the degree of frailty, or perhaps that if we look at cognitive impairment in the context of dementia, we overestimate someone's degree of frailty, that they may have some degree of physical resilience that could be called upon, for example. So some interesting debates to be opened up there, but I think showing some of the potential of trial data to explore some of the implications of frailty. This is something that I'm keen to develop going forward, because I think it raises a lot of questions as well as answering maybe one or two. The first is how do we use this to inform clinical decision making? That involves a few things. So one is, can we go on to look at how the efficacy of treatment varies, or if it does, by the degree of frailty someone has? Also, can we understand how frailty impacts specific risks that are important for treatment decisions, which allow us to weigh up the net benefits in people by their degree of frailty? The second is taking this quite numerical understanding of frailty and trying to understand how that relates to how clinicians and patients and the public understand frailty as a concept. As if we're going to operationalize this, that needs to be part of shared decisions where options are weighed up with patients in an informed way. And the understandings of frailty are quite different, I think, to what frailty in the literature is generally quantified as. And crucially as well, can we use some of this to understand how we can modify frailty, can reduce the level of frailty in individuals and populations? As for example, in exercise interventions, people with frailty are more likely to drop out of interventions in a trial setting, but actually those that complete their degree of frailty tends to respond to structured exercise, be that cardiac rehab, pulmonary rehab, these kind of things. So lots of things that I would hope to explore. We'll have to see how the funding applications go. But yes, I'll stop there and hear any questions or comments or suggestions.
Very much. So I think we've just got time for maybe a couple of quick questions. We'll take one from the room first here. Apologies for the last speaker. For the purposes of the online, would you mind just repeating the question?
Yeah,
so Caesar can pick up. So I should have said that the first time around. So any questions? First of all.
Well, I had some recent data on people that are in Scottish data, the lowest SCP group had the first heart attack 6 years before the wealthiest SCP group. Do you think that is like accelerated aging? Or is it like one group is sort of like cognitive reserve, and they're just better, and so they're basically the lowest SCP group are declining. They're both declining at the same rate, but one's declining from higher rates, and therefore they have the event later and accelerated.
So benefit those online. I think the question is around the difference in onset by deprivation in terms of health deficits manifesting earlier, and whether is that accelerated aging, or is it people from higher starting points given the background? So
I mean, I know it's slightly off topic.
No, so it's interesting. I think it's complex. I suspect there's not one simple generalizable truth there. I think at a population level, these deficits tend to accumulate at a constant rate. So people start off without these sorts of deficits and they accumulate over the life course. They certainly happen earlier in areas of higher deprivation for multiple reasons. Part of that was factor, part of that's perhaps early life events and the kind of impact of chronic stress at a kind of more cellular level, which then manifests later on and so on. So there's multiple potential mechanisms there. There's all, you mentioned kind of cardiovascular events. There are definitely accelerating events in an individual's frailty trajectory as well, where you know if something happens, then that has knock-on effects and so on. I'm not sure about the starting from a higher level. I think the inequality is probably the result of cumulative exposure to multiple risk over time, rather than it's probably the same, but it gets impacted from birth essentially, and then you see those effects magnified in later life is how I would probably conceptualize it. It's a good question.
One final question.
Thank you, Peter. I was wondering, have there been any studies that have looked at like sort of a gut instinct and how that correlates with frailty? So would a GP sort of just have a sense without knowing the numeric score of how frail the patient was, which will kind of factor into their decisions already?
We've certainly, I suspect most clinicians, unless they're interested in frailty, their conceptualization of frailty will be, I kind of know when I see it, you know, I think that's how it's used a lot of the time. And there's been a bit of a shift towards these measures beginning to be translated into practice. Clinicians got in, or that kind of gestalt, this person's of correlates a bit, but it's definitely not exact on measured frailty in that way. I think the question there is whether, I don't think one's necessarily better than the other. I think you know there are intangible things about someone that you can definitely pick up there. At the same time, I think frailty often becomes shorthand for kind of old and complex, it's difficult to know what to do with you, which is not quite getting at that kind of dynamic modifiable thing that we're trying to perhaps respond to. People mean different things by it. So there's a bit of literature there. It's definitely emerging.
Yeah, I think we've got one very quick online question as well. And Rona.
Hi, yes, I'm curious. It was interesting to see that you included cognition in some of the frailty measures, because mental and physical illness is so tightly connected. Can you really assess frailty without considering mental illness as well?
Yes. Okay. A quick answer to that is tricky. So I agree with you that if you're looking at someone's global overall health, which the Frailty Index tries to do, I think considering mental health aspects, considering cognition, given the dynamic interplay, is pretty vital. Ways in which that's done, I guess, vary. So the Frailty Index lumps it all together, as part of a kind of global overall measure. There's others which consider different domains. So someone might have like a physical frailty score or whatever, and then a cognitive, then a social aspects and so on. Or there's very physical measures, which I guess would see someone's mental health or someone's cognition as context in which their physical frailty manifests rather than part of the same measure. It depends on what you're trying to achieve with it, I think, is part of that. But I think to not to be able to consider these things, I think the best way to integrate them into what we're trying to do, you can legitimately really, I suppose. That's your question.
Thanks very much. Okay, so our final speaker is Carolyn Blake, who will talk about participatory systems. So I'll let you introduce that in more detail. Just put up this slide. Everyone see that okay online?
Mode is not the slideshow as yet. That's better.
Very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Is this loud enough? I speak. Sorry. Great. So today I'm going to be speaking about two projects I'm working on. One is the development of a new guidance document on the use of participatory systems mapping in population health, and then it's led by Lawrence Moore. And then the second project is a project looking at the mental health and well-being of call center workers in the Philippines, where we use these methods. So it'll be a kind of a whiz tour of both projects. So to start off with, what is participatory systems mapping? Let me just move this. So the way we defined it in the guidance, it's a visual representation of a system. It illustrates factors in the system and the causal relations between them. So we only looked at causal systems maps. And it facilitates, more importantly, the exploration of different processes that occur as a result of all of those dynamics in a system. For example, feedback loops. And because it has the word participatory in it, it's also looking at how to engage a range of stakeholders from within the system. So outside of the core research team to develop the maps and ensure it represents their mental models and knowledge. So here we're talking about participation more as the NIHR would define involvement. So it's involvement in the decision-making process within the research project if it's in a research context. So this is just a print screen of the current draft that we have. So the reason for talking to you about the guidance document today is obviously to raise a little bit of interest. It will be published in the early autumn, we think, but it's also a call or an invitation to contact us if you are interested in these methods or using these methods, as we are very interested in collaborations and conversations around it. The purpose and the reason why we worked on this guidance document in the last 2 years is because there's an increased kind of recognition of the need for systems approaches to address complex population challenges, but also a growing interest in population health. So it's methods that have been used more from the engineering mathematical sector. And has been used much more in environmental sciences and increasingly in population health, but there's really a lack of guidance around these methods. So the way we developed the guidance document has been a very systematic and iterative process at the same time. So we started off with a mapping review, which informed case studies. We did a 3-part expert consultation with experts from around the world that worked in research, but also intervention, development, evaluation. And then we did a synthesis of findings. And what you will find in this guidance document is an introduction to all the jargon and concepts related to participatory systems mapping, but also, more importantly, a framework to be able to think about choosing the best method for your project and also designing your project. So it's not a how-to guide, but it's kind of the first stage of what method of systems mapping should I use. Quick overview of some interesting findings from our scoping review. We found in population health that majority of studies have used causal loop diagrams as standalone, so not related, so qualitative maps. Followed by systems dynamic models, and very little use of other methods as opposed to other fields. And the main reason for using these methods has been to increase the understanding of an issue or context as opposed to developing interventions or things like research question identification. Most of systems mapping has been carried out in the field of obesity, especially childhood related, with a very famous map called the Foresight map, which has led to a lot more research in this area. And then, as you see, a few other topics that have prominence. This is just a quick visualization of what the framework will answer. So the framework can be used to really think about what is the purpose of my project, and what factors do I need to take into account in terms of feasibility of implementing various methods. So it takes the reader through a long questionnaire, questions to think about your project, and then tables to compare different methods. I'll just go into now a quick example from a project led by Kirsten Mitchell, which is called Katawag, in the Filipino language, meaning to call each other. And it's looking at call center employees' mental health within large call centers. So the business process outsourcing industry in the Philippines is huge. It employs about 1.5 million people. It's a highly competitive sector with a lot of research showing poor mental health among employees. And the study was to develop a systems-informed workplace intervention to promote mental health and well-being of call center workers in the Philippines. And we worked across 3 sites in the country. To inform the intervention, we started with to understand the context, doing a scoping review, inform and interviews. This led to systems mapping workshops with employees, validation and intervention identification workshops with employees, and then testing and refining the intervention. So as you can see, it was many workshops were carried out for the map building, and we worked by job role to start off with. So in call centers, you tend to have all agents in groups of 5 to 20 people led by team leads, where they led by managers. So we did different separate workshops by job roles, and then brought everyone together by site to do what's called validation. So it's thinking about, does the map reflect reality in your workplace, and to build consensus. So we had to very much adapt what's more traditionally used in causal loop diagram building. And they tend to be created over several days during in-person workshops with all the stakeholders that matter in a system. But due to the limited amount of time available in these very competitive private sector environments, we had about 2 hours for each workshop. So we had to adapt the methods to create to collect as much information as possible to then build the maps. So this is just an overview of how we collected as much data as possible in 2 hours, doing a lot of brainstorming using Jamboard, which we then listened back to all the transcripts and the Jamboards and traced all of the causal connections mentioned by the stakeholders. This was researcher-led. This is a very draft version of one of the initial maps from only one site. So as you can see, multiple factors and highly linked maps. What we found is similar findings across sites, so even across companies, different but complementary perspective by job roles. So when we discussed the different perspectives, the consensus building was rather easy, and a highly connected causal loop diagram. Key issues mentioned were sleep-related issues like insomnia, stress, and anxious thoughts or anxiety, depending on how people phrase that. We found, because we dived into the system, we found very many key contributing factors for these issues that are either external or internal, such as a highly competitive sector, 24/7 operations, meaning supervisors of a team are on call 24/7, etc. So it's a very tough environment to work in. Just an example of a submap. So this is a small section of our map, but it shows in the middle reinforcing feedback loop that perpetuates sleep and stress related issues. And you can see how that issue can be amplified as well, depending on what other factors come in and influence the feedback loop. So one of the interesting parts of the project was to reflect on the maps and actually use them with the stakeholders from the call centers. And we used network analysis to identify what's called optimal pathways in the system. So we used betweenness and closeness centrality to determine what factors might be most interesting to intervene on. It's obviously not a magic bullet solution, so the evolving methods or approaches in that area consider to do those analysis and then as well at the feedback loops, but also bring those to the stakeholders to assess feasibility and the importance and the feasibility within a context to address those issues. So we had many discussions on feasibility, We also looked at the evidence base from our scoping review on what works in terms of interventions. And we built consensus across the job roles. In the end, what was decided as a consensus was to focus on a coaching program for team leads on mental health and well-being and communication. I can just bring you back to the map, and you can see at the top, the third factor to the right, quality of communication within teams. That area was seen as something that could be worked on within the setting of the company, but also the intervention that the scope of the project, which was a 6-month intervention package. In terms of the perceptions on the process, system stakeholders really appreciated to be able to visualize in a picture other staff's perceptions on what was going on in the company. And many saw the mapping workshops as a mental health promotion activity in itself. It was the first time for many to actually talk about mental health more openly and to talk about the issues in the workplace. And for us, we found it feasible to adapt the method to time-scarce environments, online environments as well. But there was a heavy reliance on researcher time as opposed to more traditional ways of doing it. If you're interested in finding out more on this project, we have a research brief and also a newly produced animation that explains systems mapping and the project on our website.
Any questions? Yeah, I'll get you to repeat the question for online.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I think we will be really grateful recipients of this report, actually, because we've been involved in a process, really difficult process of co-production, and I guess I'm just really struck about how much time it must have taken to put all of those. I mean, that must have been hugely time consuming. But what were the benefits that you found in terms of the ability to kind of get your ideas across, or get the ideas of the group across?
The benefits of,
well, it's I can see there's so much work went into actually working out what the connections were, but did it give you a bang for your buck in terms of being able to explain it, I suppose?
yes, so the question is whether in a sense the complexity of the map and the number of factors and links, whether it was actually how we're going to report on it, and whether it was useful. So, yeah, that is our ongoing struggle, I would say, is the amount of data we collected, because we tried to be as open as possible, and even with a lot of we tried to build consensus and a lot of voting exercises on really narrowing down the key factors, but it ended up being quite complex with over, I think, 100 factors in our map. So that's where I think the bringing it back to the stakeholders was really useful, and understanding from their perspective where the key areas of the map were, and also the network analysis that enables you to see where what factors are key influencing factors within the whole system. But obviously what we notice is a lot of the key issues in the system are external to the employees' sphere of influence, and also the company's sphere of influence. It has to do with a lot of global dynamics of, corporate competition, which are beyond the scope of this project. So that's how we had to narrow it down to make it feasible.
Yeah, I think we've got one more possible question. Time for one more if there's any from the room, otherwise we'll go online. Any questions? Any questions so far? Any questions? Anything within the room at all?
I think I've seen parts of that before, and I really enjoy that. And really interesting. What I wonder is, like, you talk about the causal loops and causal links between different factors. How do you establish, or how do you find causality here? Is it how people perceive it, or if they agree on it, or based on other research, you match with that basically?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. The question is around how do we determine causality and causal links between factors? Is it stakeholders' perceptions or is it based on other data? So that's very much, I think, dependent on the methods, but also I would say the stance of the researcher, or the worldview of the research group. Causal loop diagrams on their own have many ways of being built. The most common is via stakeholders' mental models, so how the stakeholders in the system view it. But often it's a combination of using literature, other evidence-based secondary data to complement or even to build only based off of causal links that have been, that are evidenced in the literature. So I think it's always, it's a tricky area, but it has to do with the purpose of the research always, and what is the final output. So is it just to understand a context in the eyes of the stakeholders who live in it? Or is it maybe for modeling, you know, for other purposes where you would you require other data to support the causal links?
Thank you. Okay, thanks again to all our speakers. Just to say, it's the cross team seminars now taking a break for the summer, but we'll be back again in September. We're always looking for speakers, so if anyone wants to speak at any of those seminars, then please get in touch with myself. So I'm Michael Fleming, Mona Strawbridge, Benjamin Rigby, and also Hamish Foster as well. So that's the please get in touch. 100%. Thanks very much, everybody.